Hello, this is Philosophy 67, Political Philosophy, and this is week 6 for us in the semester, and we are doing today, the class would be on colonialism and decolonization. Remember that we have done the first part of the class, the first 4 weeks. The title was Sovereign Power and Dialectical Subversions, right? We started with Hobbes, then we got into Carl Schmitt, right? And then Hegel, uh, to whom we'll go back today briefly, and Marx, right? And then in part 2 of the class that we are doing now, part 2 is called, the title is Captures and Lines of Flight, and then the prison and the camp. Okay, so we did last week. The class was on feminism, class and gender, so-called women's work. So we saw some passages from a book by Dalla Costa, right, and James, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Selma James, and then also from Caliban and the Witch, a chapter from Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. And so today I ask you to read a little more, right? For today, the first chapter from right, this book, the Wretched of the Earth, right? The chapter is called Concerning Violence by Frantz Fanon. And actually, I'm going to speak a little about this text only, okay, in a moment. But you should also read chapter 4 and chapter 6 from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, as well as the text that Thomas Sankara, the president assassinated, then president in 1987, he was assassinated, but the president of Burkina Faso, revolutionary and president of Burkina Faso, he wrote this, he gave this speech, United Front Against Debt, 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 okay, that you find, it's included in the material that you had to read. And also, for today, I ask you to watch the movie by Gillo Pontecorvo, the movie The Battle of Algiers, that I put again the link for you on Blackboard. So do this, read these chapters, this material, and watch the movie as well. The movie is also very important. It's probably the best way to get an understanding of the real situation of under colonialism, and then also the war. This is an instance of, but the war of liberation, that the Algerians fought against France, the one of the colonial powers, the European colonial powers in Africa. So in any case, we are not going to be able to speak about the history of colonialism very much, but again, I read the chapters by that will give you a sense, an idea, by Walter Rodney, right? How Europe underdeveloped Africa, and then let's speak a little about this chapter from The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. The chapter is called, chapter 1 is called Concerning Violence. And Frantz Fanon, briefly I say he was a psychiatrist as well as a political philosopher and revolutionary from Martinique, in the Caribbean, and then he went to France and then to Algeria, and he took part also in the Liberation War, so in any case, what I ask you to do, then also remember that to write the journal entry every week, maybe spend a little more time elaborating on some of the ideas this time. Again, this is just my suggestion, but you can write more. and by as you read the material, right? But I say, for example, right, think about what Fanon says at the beginning, at the outset of this chapter. He says decolonization is the true creation, veritable true creation of a new man, right? And then he repeats this idea. What's the meaning of that? And then what is this creation of a new humanity that Fanon is speaking about? But give a sense also, give an account of what Fanon is saying in this chapter. Again, I mean, if you go to page 2 of the text that you have at the beginning, the outset. I mean, he speaks about national liberation, national renaissance, and then he says, this is line 3 from the top. I call attention to some of these important moments in the text by Fanon. Decolonization, he says, is always a violent phenomenon, right? I mean, the chapter itself, the title is concerning violence, and then you will see, right, I mean, as you read the chapter, that he then also addresses the important question of the difference between violence, if you will, right, original violence, and counter violence, right, which is already, as a form, as a scheme already implied in right, when we say colonization, colonialism on the one hand, and then decolonization. Okay, so that's violence, counter violence. The idea, ultimately, again, that as Martin Luther King also says in his letter from Birmingham jail, right, oppressed people will not be oppressed forever. But in any case, we will see what this is also the struggle, the fight between the oppressor and the oppressed that Fanon uh, speaks about. We will see that also in relation to what we saw in Hegel, right? The dialectic of so-called dialectic of master and slave, and we'll make reference to that again, also because there is a clear connection between what Fanon does in terms of philosophy and Hegel as well. So in any case, line 5 from the top again, he says, I read these few words, okay, that speaking again about still about decolonization, right, liberation from, emancipation from colonization, right? He says that this is the replacing of a certain species of man by another species of man. Okay, so what's important also to understand, because I don't know how much time we have, I don't want to keep this very long, but you will see that it is not simply the case, just like with Hegel, ultimately, that there is simply an inversion that, then, the oppressed becomes the oppressor in turn, right? Decolonization and the creation of a new man, a new humanity, is really the end, should be the end of oppression, as such, and the end of, therefore, the end of violence as such. Okay, so this is basically what. So it's not that one species then takes, so to speak, the upper hand, right, and dominates the other one. No, but one, right, he says a certain species of man, right, is replaced by another one. Okay, so and he says that of course there is always this complete disorder. But speaking about the question of new humanity, because again, I don't know how much time, right, we have, I want to connect immediately for you, right, to so that to give you some pointers, highlight some important connections within the text itself. You go from page 2 to also then page 40, page 41, and the very end of the chapter, page 45, okay, where this idea is taken up again in important ways. Okay, so for example, on page 40, right, in your text. You see toward the end, the bottom of the page, that Fanon says what counts today, right? The question which is looming on the horizon is the need for a redistribution of wealth. And he then says humanity must reply to this question or be shaken to pieces by it. Okay, so this is a quote from Fanon. So this, of course, goes back both to the question that we saw in Hegel, the dialectical subversion of right, the scheme of sovereignty, of power, of violence, of sovereign violence, and also Marx that we saw at one point, right? So, but what's important here is again still this, making of humanity that Fanon is addressing, and remember also watch the movie, right? I mean the movie, The Battle of Algiers, great movie, right? Made, I believe, in 1961. That's when the more or less the war, the Algerian War of Liberation against France, then ended, right? And but in any case, this is important in relation to Fanon, also because Fanon himself was involved in the Algerian liberation movement and war. So, but in any case, then on page 41. Uh, he says again that everything, this is more or less in the middle of the page, it's highlighted for you. The fact is that everything needs to be reformed and everything needs to be thought again, thought anew. Okay? So, and then that's page 41. And then really, this is the very end that I call attention to now in the text, okay, page 45, and I read the whole thing, because it's important, and again, I don't know how much time I have to go over other important moments in the text, but again, read especially the highlighted sections, but everything, okay? So he says, this is in the last paragraph, okay, the third world, right, the third world does not mean to organize a great crusade of hunger against the whole of Europe. Then we will see how, for Fanon, Europe is really a creation of the third world, and this links to the text by the speech by Thomas Sankara, right, the president from of Burkina Faso that I mentioned before. You had that letter, read it, okay, against that, right? And Fanon continues what it expects from those who for centuries have kept it in slavery is that they will help it to rehabilitate mankind and make men victorious everywhere. So again, it's not simply a matter of just a specific, as important as that is, struggle, fight, or war of liberation, but it is really the remaking of humanity as a whole, humanity as such. Okay, rehabilitate mankind and make men victorious everywhere, once and for all. But it is clear that we are not so naive, and he says, as to think that this will come about with the cooperation and the goodwill of the European governments. So there is this moment of struggle that Fanon is speaking about. This, of course, that's what war is, violence, right? But again, remember, you will find, I will point that out in a moment in the text where he speaks about violence and counter violence. But to give you just, the page right now, one of the moments in which he speaks about that is certainly page 24. You go there, I'll go back in a moment, and okay, page 12 and page 13 about the nature of violence. Okay, so but to continue with the reading of this, he says this huge task, again, this is Fanon, right? This is I'm reading from the text. this huge task which consists of reintroducing mankind into the world, the whole of mankind, right? I mean, it's an all inclusive category that he's speaking about, as problematic as that is, the category, the concept of humanity, mankind, will be carried out with the indispensable help of the European peoples, who themselves must realize that in the past they have often joined the ranks of our common masters where colonial questions were concerned. Okay, so think about this. I'll go back now briefly to the beginning. So I just make for you, right? I mean, to show you the connection between basically the beginning, page 2, the beginning of the outset of this chapter, and the final moments, right, as well as the last page, the end. But then, going back to page 3, for example, he speaks of right, we saw the creation of a new humanity. You find the phrase "a new humanity" at the very bottom of page 2. And then page 3, he says, the thing which has been colonized, the thing, right, in quotation marks, right, which in quotes, which has been colonized, becomes man during the same process by which it frees itself. Okay, so think about this also in relation to, link this back to what we saw with Hegel, and the subversion, the inversion of right, the power relations, right, in the dialectic between master and slave, right? So and Fanon says, in decolonization, this is still page 3, there is therefore the need of a complete calling in question of the colonial situation. Now think about this also in terms of not only the colonial situation at the time of colonialism in its, specifics, the specificity of its historical, right, happening, but also more generally, even today, what are the situations of, what are the colonial situations that we can still see today in the world, in many parts of the world, but even in unexpected situations, right? I mean, all ultimately forms of oppression can be understood that way. So, if we wish, he says, to describe it precisely, that's Fanon, we might find it in the well-known words, right? And he is quoting the well-known, words, the last shall be first, and the first last, and so on. And he says decolonization is the putting into practice of this sentence. That is why, all decolonization is successful. But remember that here it's not a question of taking the upper hand, so to speak. It is not the case that those who are dominated now will be later dominating in turn. Those who are oppressed will be oppressing others later in turn. That's not what Fanon is speaking about. That's not what he thinks decolonization is, but it is, again, I say that again because it's very important, is the remaking of humanity as such. It is really the constitution of a new humanity. And so then he gives this very, realistic and very important description of the relationship between the settlers and the natives, even in terms, for example, you will see how he describes the town itself divided, right? And that's what he says. This is very important that, Fanon says at the beginning of the last paragraph on page 3, the colonial world is a world cut in two. There is this twofold, right? To say the least, structure. There is this division, right? It is a wall cut in two with borders everywhere, frontiers, and so on and so forth. This is something that you will see very well, appreciate very well in the wonderful movie that you should watch, The Battle of Algiers. Okay, so also what Fanon says in terms of his right, description of the relationship between the settlers, I say again, and the natives, right, and again, on page toward the end of page 4, he says the same. This wall divided into compartments, this wall cut in two, right, is inhabited by two different species. Okay, so that's basically, it's a very strong moment that we see in Fanon, the question of those who see themselves as the self, the master, in terms of no Hegel, and then the others, the foreigner, and so on, the oppressed, and he uses the word right. Actually, he says, of course, the settler still remains a foreigner throughout, and so this is very important as well. But it is also key in order to understand precisely the very important relationship between violence and counter-violence. Okay, I hope that think about that, because when you find this question of violence and counter-violence, considering that the colonization, Fanon says on page 11, right? He says colonization as such is the history of a pillage, right? The history of stealing, the history of violence. That's what colonization is, which is actually also what sovereignty in general is, according to another philosopher as well that we are not studying, but power, sovereign power. In any case, you will see the important question of. I'll go back to that in a moment. Right, this you will see the word Manichaean also, right, on page 39, then 41, that too, but also on page 5. Manichaean is precisely this idea of a division between into two spheres, good and evil, and so on and so forth. Okay, so. And that's what he says, right? That the native is declared by the settler, right? The negation of all values, the absolute evil, and that's very important. There is here, if you will, also a link back to Carl Schmitt when we saw, the question of the enemy, and the fact that the enemy as such is always dehumanized. There is always this dehumanization of the enemy that serves very often, always as an ideological justification for oppression, right? That's what the oppressors usually do, right? To dehumanize the enemy, and that's what they perceive as the enemy. That's what on page 6 also Fanon says. At times this Manichaeism, again, this way of looking at things as in this type of clear-cut distinction, right? For example, you have good on the one hand, evil on the other, and of course we are always good, the others are always evil, and so on and so forth. That's the typical logic of violence, primordial violence, originary violence, and war. And evil, right? That's the usually the justification. That's the discourse, the narrative. Evil must be eliminated, right? I mean, must be annihilated and so on, destroyed and so on, right? So he says this is really he speaks Fanon about this dehumanization, right? It dehumanizes the native, or to speak plainly, he says this is paragraph 2, the beginning of paragraph 2 on page 6. It turns into him, the native, into an animal. Okay? In fact, the terms the settler uses when he mentions the native are zoological terms. The enemy, right, dehumanized, becomes an animal. This is, we will see this more when we get into, then in the following weeks when we do read some Agamben, work by Giorgio Agamben, right? I mean, you will see when are we going to do that? Maybe week 8, okay? So in any case, that's basically the idea. Any genocidal regime has done that. I mean, the Nazi regime, right? That's what they did. The people, the right Jews and all the others sent to the concentration and then extermination camps, right? I mean, they were dehumanized in the same way, stripped of their, uh, legal, political rights, persona, as well as of their clothes very often, and sent to extermination, and they were referred to uh, as like animals, right? The same with the genocide in Rwanda, right? So we'll speak more about this, but that's basically the idea, right? I mean, and so this dehumanization and these zoological terms that are assigned to the enemy, to the evil enemy, as Nietzsche would say, um, become important in the language, the narrative, the self justification of the oppressor in order to continue doing what they do. Okay, so Fanon is very clear about this, and so this is really what sets the stage for you for an understanding of this otherwise very uh, problematic, relationship between violence, counter-violence, or just the idea of what violence is, right? And that's the title of the chapter by Fanon concerning violence. Okay, so then he makes also an interesting, uh, reference to the problem of individualism, in which is the first to disappear, and in the process of decolonization. And he says how actually it is right. I mean, this the self criticism and the end of individualism and communalism, right? I mean, is he says few people realize that it is an African institution, right? I mean, think about this, what it means to think about oneself as an independent, sovereign individual. If I think about myself as the self as such, and all the others are precisely, usually denied, this this capacity of being, a self as well. This is very often what we find in um, relationships of even interpersonal relationships, but certainly relationships, political relationships of war and so on, based on power. But the idea is, he says, it is an African institution, it is communal self criticism. It's interesting that in the tradition, he doesn't mention that, Fanon himself, but in the philosophical tradition of Africa, of Southern Africa, not South Africa, Southern Africa, in the Zulu language, culture. There is this concept of Ubuntu, which is very important, which Ubuntu, UBUNTU, you can Google that and find out, which is another word for humanity, which really means, right, that it means I am because we are, right? I mean, a person is through and because of other people, right? So this is what, in a sense, Fanon is addressing uh, in on page 8, 9, 10. So in any case, then he speaks on page 12 about the settlers, but I had to wrap up soon. The settlers' obsession with security. Again, you will see that also in some very powerful moments in the Battle of Algiers, but we can again realize, we can see this today, generally, by looking at the question of the border, right? The question of sovereignty, the border, in the question of migration and so on, the question of say, the airports. We will speak more about this. This emphasis, to say the least, this obsession, one might say, with security, right? Um, so in any case, then I want to go briefly to page 17, and I hope that this may, help you get an understanding of some of the important points. There are so many here, but on page 17, the end of the first paragraph on the page, the last sentence, still of course speaking about the Algerian situation particularly, um, and he says it is and colonialism in general, it is violence in its natural state, well, I say original primordial violence, and it will only, I'm reading again, it will only yield when confronted with greater violence. Okay, so this is perhaps the central moment, one of the central moments in this chapter, the question of violence, highly problematic, very difficult question. What is violence? Concerning violence, if you have violence, as he says, in its natural state, primordial violence, original violence, then there will also be another and greater maybe violence, that it will, because that violence will yield only to that type of violence. Okay, so he speaks about also the question of non-violence. He addresses that briefly, but think about this, and um, he says that this violence is in, he says, in the atmosphere. It is always there, right? I mean, it's not that you can, right? I mean, escape from violence, because he says, right, a colonized people precisely discovers that violence is in the atmosphere, right? So, and on page 23, um, the beginning of the third paragraph, line 3, from the beginning of the third paragraph, he says, right, I mean, speaking, he says that he addresses the question of the fact that the situation, right, the struggle between oppressor and oppressed can be solved by force. Everything can be solved by force. Okay, um, and then on page 24 he asks the question: what is the real nature of this violence? Right. This is a sentence that I'm reading, a question that he has on page again 24. The nature of this violence, what is it? right? I mean, and he goes, into that as well, and so um, he says, for example, on page 31, right? I mean, for the native, this violence represents the absolute line of action. The militant is also a man who works. Work, we saw that already, speaking about, right, when we did Hegel and then Marx and then Dalla Costa and James and Federici last time. And this, at the end of this paragraph on page, again, right, 31, there is this very strong sentence, think about this. He says, to work means to work for the death of the settler. Okay, so go back to Hegel's dialectic of master and slave, the struggle to the death that we saw there, and the question of the war of liberation. I mean, a liberation that again is whether one likes it or not, it's something that happens because of conditions that have been created, produced to begin with, right? I mean, revolution, right? A war of liberation, revolution. I mean, all revolutions in history, I mean, very interesting. But think about, I don't know, the French Revolution, but the Haitian Revolution, right? The revolution in Haiti, where, right, which is a clear, if you will, illustration of what we saw in Hegel, the master and slave dialectic, right, during the Haitian Revolution. Then Toussaint Louverture, check this online, a former slave becomes the leader of a liberated, freed Haiti. Okay, so same idea. Um, Fanon says in the middle of page 31, the colonized man finds his freedom in and through violence. Okay, so I want you to think about this. What say you, what your reaction is, what your thoughts are about this, the necessity of something like this, or what makes Fanon say something like this. He also says at the end of page 33, the very bottom, the violence, right, of that's what I was speaking about earlier, and then I close here. The violence, he addresses the violence of the colonial regime, right? So we had this type of violence. Think about that. The violence of the colonial regime and the counter violence. That's what Fanon says. Over the native, right? So the whole sentence reads, let me read it again. The violence of the colonial regime and the counter violence of the native balance each other and respond to each other in an extraordinary reciprocal homogeneity. Then he goes right from page 33 to page 34. So he speaks about this violence, right? And he says, again, this is line 2 from the top of page 34, the development of violence among the colonized people will be proportionate to the violence exercised by the threatened colonial regime. Okay, so this is also very important. And look, maybe I close here. This is page, again, page 33 and 34. That's where you find precisely, the problematization of violence, counter violence. And this is again something that you will see very well as well in the Battle of Algiers, okay, in the movie, right, that you should watch, okay. And I close here just to say that then there is a link, certainly a clear link that you can make on page 39 when he speaks of he addresses the question of European wealth, European opulence on the one hand, and slavery, right? This is a clear link that you can make to those chapters that I ask you to read from the other book, okay, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Okay, but I close here. Again, I hope that this gives you a sense of read more of and of course the question of this stolen wealth that ultimately he's speaking about, right? Both Fanon and Rodney, Walter Rodney's in again how Europe underdeveloped Africa. This links again very importantly to the speech that Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso gave in 1987, and this idea of having to refuse to pay, although that's what Europe for Fanon has done to begin with. So, in any case, I close here, and then next time we'll go back. Probably next time we are doing. Let me see. The question of slavery and the prisons. But in any case, do again write your journal entry, and maybe since that's what you're doing in terms of writing requirements this semester, this because of the emergency, maybe spend a little more time, develop your entry a bit more, go to the text, use some important relevant passages, a couple, a few of them, and elaborate on them and say what you think about this, about the passages that you choose, about the themes, the problems, the concepts that we have seen, particularly today, the concept of violence, and the uh, difficult relationship between what we see again, the question, the difficult question of violence, counter violence, and what ultimately violence is, and how, because Fanon addresses that as well, how violence can be, right, overcome, right, because that's ultimately what Fanon is speaking about in terms of the construction of a new humanity. Okay, so I end here and see you next time. Okay, thank you, bye.